My husband forbade me from attending my own mother's funeral. When I discovered the shocking reason, my world fell apart. The truth behind it is unimaginable, said Evelyn Hawthorne. Evelyn Hawthorne's day began like any other in the small Connecticut town she called home. At 68, she had settled into a routine that filled her days but left her nights empty. The greenhouse was her first stop. Evelyn tended to her prized orchids, adjusting the humidity and checking for pests. Her fingers, though not as nimble as they once were, still moved with practiced precision. As she pruned a phalaenopsis, her mind wandered to the blue ribbon it had won at last year's county fair. A fleeting smile crossed her face, quickly replaced by a familiar emptiness. By mid-morning, Evelyn was at the local library, sorting through returned books. She chatted with patrons, recommending titles and helping with research. The busy work kept her thoughts at bay, but couldn't entirely silence the nagging feeling that something was missing. "Mrs. Hawthorne, could you help me find a book on gardening?" a young woman asked. Evelyn nodded, leading her to the appropriate section. As she pulled out a volume on perennials, a memory flashed unbidden. Her mother, Margaret, teaching her to plant marigolds. The image faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving a bitter taste in Evelyn's mouth. At home, Evelyn prepared dinner. The kitchen was silent, save for the chopping of vegetables and the occasional sizzle from the stove. Howard would be home soon, and the thought filled her with a vague sense of unease. The front door opened and closed. Howard's footsteps echoed through the house. Evelyn set the table, her movements mechanical. "Evening," Howard said, sitting down. "How was your day?" Evelyn asked, more out of habit than interest. "Fine. Busy." They ate in silence, the clink of cutlery against plates the only sound. Evelyn glanced at Howard, noting the deepening lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples. When had they stopped really talking? After dinner, Howard retreated to his study. Evelyn cleaned up, her mind drifting. She found herself by the phone, her hand hovering over the receiver. Margaret's number, though unused for years, was still etched in her memory. Evelyn's finger traced the first digit. She could call. She could bridge the gap that had grown between them. But what would she say? How could she explain the years of silence? The moment stretched, taut with possibility. Then, like a soap bubble bursting, it was gone. Evelyn's hand fell away from the phone. She turned, heading upstairs to bed, leaving the call unmade and the past undisturbed. As she lay in bed, Howard's steady breathing beside her, Evelyn stared at the ceiling. Her life was comfortable, stable. She had a home, a husband, a place in the community. So why did she feel so empty? In the darkness, memories surfaced. Margaret's face, twisted in anger. Harsh words exchanged, doors slamming. The weight of unspoken truths hung in the air, as tangible now as they had been decades ago. Evelyn turned, burying her face in the pillow. Tomorrow would be another day. Another round of orchids and books and quiet dinners. Another day of not calling Margaret. Another day of pretending the past didn't exist. But as sleep finally claimed her, a small part of Evelyn wondered how long she could keep up the charade. How long before the carefully constructed walls of her ordinary world came crumbling down. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Evelyn sipped her coffee. She unfolded the local newspaper, her eyes skimming the headlines. As she turned to the obituaries, a familiar name caught her attention. Her coffee cup clattered against the saucer. Margaret Hawthorne, 88, passed away. Evelyn's hands shook as she read the notice. It couldn't be true. She hadn't spoken to her mother in years, but surely someone would have told her if Margaret had died. The obituary blurred as Evelyn's mind raced. Memories of her last conversation with Margaret flooded back. The shouting, the accusations, the slamming door. Evelyn had vowed never to speak to her mother again. Now it seemed she would never have the chance. A surge of anger rose in her chest. How dare they not inform her? She was Margaret's daughter, estranged or not. The anger quickly gave way to a gnawing guilt. She should have called. She should have tried to mend things. Evelyn reached for the phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed the hospital's number. Her heart pounded as she waited for someone to answer. "Greenville General Hospital, how may I direct your call?" "I'm calling about Margaret Hawthorne," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw her obituary in the paper, but I'm her daughter and I wasn't notified." A pause. "One moment, please." The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. Evelyn's mind conjured images of funeral arrangements, of a life ended without resolution. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" A new voice came on the line. "This is Dr. Patterson. I'm afraid there's been a mistake. Your mother is alive, but she's in critical condition." Evelyn's knees buckled. She sank into a chair. "What happened?" "She suffered a severe stroke 2 days ago. We've been trying to reach her next of kin." The doctor paused. "Mrs. Hawthorne, your mother doesn't have much time left. She's been asking for you." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Margaret was dying. Margaret wanted to see her. After all these years, after all the silence, her mother was reaching out. "Mrs. Hawthorne, are you there?" Evelyn realized she hadn't spoken. "Yes, I'm here." How long does she have?" "It's hard to say. Days, maybe. If you want to see her, I'd suggest coming as soon as possible." The conversation ended, but Evelyn sat motionless. The phone still pressed to her ear. She should feel relieved that Margaret wasn't dead, shouldn't she? Instead, a storm of emotions raged within her. Part of her wanted to ignore the call, to let the past remain in the past. It would be easier that way. No confrontations, no reopening of old wounds. She could stay in her safe, predictable life. But another part of her, a part she had tried to silence for years, screamed for action. This was her last chance to make things right, to get answers, to say goodbye. Evelyn's gaze fell on a framed photo on the mantel. It showed a much younger version of herself with Margaret, both smiling at a long-ago Christmas. When had things gone so wrong? The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, a reminder that time was running out. Evelyn stood, her decision made. She couldn't let things end this way. As she moved to pack a bag, Evelyn's mind raced with questions. What would she say to Margaret? Could decades of hurt be healed in a few days? And how would Howard react when she told him she was leaving? The comfortable routine of her life was about to be shattered. Evelyn felt fear, but also a spark of something else. Anticipation? Hope? Whatever lay ahead, she knew her world would never be the same. Evelyn stood in the bedroom, her half-packed suitcase open on the bed. Her initial determination to see Margaret wavered as doubts crept in. The sound of Howard's car pulling into the driveway made her stomach clench. "Evelyn?" Howard's voice echoed through the house. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath and went downstairs. Howard stood in the living room, eyeing the suitcase in her hand. "My mother is dying," Evelyn said. "I'm going to see her." Howard's face hardened. "Margaret? After all these years, why bother?" "She's asked for me. It might be my last chance, too." "To what?" Howard interrupted. "Rehash old arguments? Let her hurt you again?" Evelyn flinched as a memory surfaced. Margaret's voice sharp with anger. "You ungrateful child. After all I've sacrificed for you." The slam of a door. Tears on a younger Evelyn's face. "You don't understand," Evelyn said, pushing the memory away. "I need to do this." Howard stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Think about what you're doing, Evelyn. You have a life here. Responsibilities. It's just for a few days, I'll be back." "No." Howard's tone was final. "I forbid it." Evelyn stared at him, shock turning to anger. "You forbid it? I'm not a child, Howard. You're my wife. Your place is here." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. When had their marriage become this? "What about your mother's estate?" Howard asked, changing tack. "Have you considered that?" Evelyn frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Margaret's not poor, Evelyn. There are assets to consider." "Assets? My mother is dying and you're talking about money?" Howard's expression shifted, a flicker of something. Guilt, fear, crossing his face. "I'm just looking out for our interests. Someone needs to." A suspicion formed in Evelyn's mind. "Howard, what do you know about my mother's finances?" He hesitated a moment too long. "Nothing. I just assumed." "Don't lie to me." Evelyn's voice sharpened. "What aren't you telling me?" Howard's demeanor changed, his tone becoming placating. "It's complicated, Evelyn. I've been helping Margaret manage some investments. For your benefit, of course." "My benefit? You've been in contact with my mother? For how long?" Howard didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her feet. How much of her life was built on lies? "I'm going," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You can't stop me." Howard's eyes narrowed. "If you walk out that door, don't expect things to be the same when you return." The threat hung in the air. Evelyn looked at her husband. Really looked at him. and wondered how she had missed the signs. The controlling behavior, the secrets, the manipulation. How long had she been living in this gilded cage? For a moment, Evelyn considered giving in. It would be easier to stay, to maintain the peace, to not rock the boat. The thought of confronting Margaret, of facing the past, filled her with dread. But the image of her mother, alone in a hospital bed, waiting for a daughter who might never come, tugged at her heart. And now, with Howard's revelation, there were too many unanswered questions. Evelyn straightened her spine. "I'm going, Howard. We'll discuss everything else when I return." She turned and walked towards the door, half expecting Howard to try and physically stop her. He didn't. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the man she had shared her life with for years. In that moment, he seemed like a stranger. As Evelyn stepped outside, a mix of emotions swirled within her. Fear of the unknown, anger at Howard's deception, guilt over the years of silence with Margaret. But underneath it all, a small spark of something else flickered to life. Hope, perhaps, or the first taste of freedom. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Evelyn took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with potential heartbreak and long-buried truths. But for the first time in years, Evelyn felt truly alive. She got into her car and started the engine. As she pulled out of the driveway, Evelyn glanced in the rearview mirror. Howard stood at the window watching her go. She didn't look back again. Evelyn sat in her car, parked a block away from her house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The confrontation with Howard had left her shaken, unsure of her next move. A tap on the window startled her. Susan, her best friend of 30 years, stood outside, concern etched on her face. Evelyn unlocked the doors. "I saw Howard leave," Susan said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Are you okay?" Evelyn shook her head, words failing her. Susan reached over and squeezed her hand. "I have something to show you," Susan said. "But not here. Can we go to my place?" 20 minutes later, they sat at Susan's kitchen table. A manila envelope lay between them. "I've been debating whether to show you this," Susan began. "But with Margaret in the hospital, I can't keep it to myself any longer." She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of letters. Evelyn recognized Howard's handwriting immediately, and next to it, unmistakably, was her mother's. "Where did you get these?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been intercepting them," Susan admitted. "For the past year. I'm on the board at the post office, remember?" Evelyn's hand shook as she picked up the top letter. It was dated just 3 months ago. "Margaret, the transfer is complete. Evelyn remains unaware of our arrangement. I suggest we proceed as discussed. Howard." Evelyn's vision blurred. She set the letter down, her mind reeling. "There's more," Susan said gently. She spread out several letters, pointing to key phrases. "From what I can piece together, Howard's been managing Margaret's finances for years, and it seems they have some sort of plan involving you." "But why?" Evelyn asked. "Why would they keep this from me?" Susan shook her head. "I don't know, but Evelyn, you need to confront this. Both of them." Evelyn stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. "I can't believe this. All these years I thought, and Howard, just this morning, he tried to stop me from going to see Margaret." "Of course he did," Susan said. "He doesn't want you to find out the truth." Evelyn stopped pacing, a sudden realization hitting her. "The obituary. Do you think?" Susan nodded grimly. "It's possible. It could have been a ploy to get you to contact Margaret." Evelyn sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. "What am I supposed to do now?" "You go," Susan said firmly. "You go see your mother and you get answers. It's time, Evelyn. No more hiding from the past." Evelyn looked at her friend. Seeing the determination in her eyes, she felt a surge of gratitude for Susan's unwavering support. "I'm scared," Evelyn admitted. "I know," Susan said. "But you're stronger than you think, and you deserve the truth." Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions wash over her. Betrayal at Howard's deception, anger at the years of manipulation, but also a growing determination to uncover the truth. "Will you help me?" Evelyn asked. Susan smiled. "Of course. That's what friends are for." They spent the next hour planning. Susan would keep an eye on Howard in the house. She'd also do some digging into Margaret's financial records, using her connections in town. As they talked, Evelyn felt her resolve strengthen. The comfort of female friendship, the solidarity of shared purpose, bolstered her courage. Thank you, Evelyn said as they wrapped up their planning. I don't know what I'd do without you. Susan hugged her tightly. You'd figure it out. You're tougher than you give yourself credit for, but I'm glad I can help. Evelyn left Susan's house with a clear plan and a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with potential heartbreak and long-buried secrets. But she was no longer facing it alone. As she drove towards the hospital, Evelyn glanced at the envelope of letters on the seat beside her. They represented years of deception, but also the key to unlocking the truth. Whatever awaited her at the hospital, whatever confrontation lay ahead with Margaret, Evelyn knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't terrify her. It invigorated her. The familiar streets of her town gave way to the highway. Evelyn pressed down on the accelerator, leaving behind the comfort of her known world. Ahead lay answers, confrontations, and perhaps a chance at real freedom. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, a notepad in front of her. The house was quiet, Howard's snores drifting from upstairs. She checked her watch, 11:30 p.m. It was time to put her plan into action. She began packing essentials into a small bag: clothes, toiletries, medication. As she reached for her blood pressure pills, a wave of dizziness hit her. Evelyn gripped the edge of the dresser, waiting for it to pass. When it didn't, she fumbled for her blood pressure monitor. The reading was higher than usual. Evelyn frowned, considering the implications. The stress of the past few days was taking its toll. For a moment, she wavered. Was she really up for this journey? A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally breaking. Evelyn squared her shoulders. She had come too far to turn back now. She crept down the stairs, wincing at every creak. At the bottom, she paused to catch her breath. Another wave of dizziness washed over her. Evelyn closed her eyes, willing it to pass. "Evelyn?" Her eyes snapped open. Howard stood at the top of the stairs, his face a mix of confusion and anger. "What are you doing?" he demanded, descending the stairs. Evelyn straightened, clutching her bag. "I'm going to see my mother." Howard's eyes narrowed. "We discussed this. You're not going anywhere." "You don't get to decide that for me, Howard." He reached the bottom of the stairs, looming over her. "Think about what you're throwing away. Our life, our future." "What future?" Evelyn shot back. "One built on lies and manipulation?" Howard's face paled. "What are you talking about?" "I know about the letters, Howard. About your arrangement with Margaret." For a moment, Howard looked genuinely frightened. Then his expression hardened. "You don't understand. I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Evelyn laughed bitterly. "By keeping me in the dark? By controlling every aspect of my life?" Howard reached for her arm. "You're not thinking clearly. You're sick. You need to rest." Evelyn jerked away from his grasp. "Don't touch me. I'm leaving, and you can't stop me." "If you walk out that door," Howard's voice was low, dangerous, "don't bother coming back." The words hung in the air between them. Evelyn felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was it, the point of no return. "Goodbye, Howard," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She turned and walked to the door, half expecting Howard to physically restrain her. He didn't. As she stepped outside, the rain hit her face, cool and refreshing. Evelyn hurried to her car, fumbling with the keys. Behind her, she heard the front door open. "You'll regret this," Howard called over the sound of the storm. "You're nothing without me." Evelyn didn't look back. She started the car and pulled out of the driveway, her headlights cutting through the rain. As she drove, the adrenaline began to wear off. The reality of what she had done settled in. She was 68 years old, driving into a storm, leaving behind everything familiar. Her hands shook on the steering wheel. But mixed with the fear was a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. She was making her own choices, for better or worse. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to travel. An hour into her journey, Evelyn pulled into a rest stop. She needed to check her blood pressure and take a moment to gather herself. The reading was still high, but not dangerously so. She took her medication and closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing. In the quiet of the car, doubts began to creep in. Was she making a mistake? Should she turn back? Then she remembered the letters, Howard's controlling behavior, the years of secrets and lies. No, there was no going back. Evelyn opened her eyes, a new determination settling over her. Whatever lay ahead, confrontations with Margaret, uncovering painful truths, facing an uncertain future, she would handle it. She was stronger than she had realized. As she pulled back onto the highway, the storm began to ease. The first hints of dawn were visible on the horizon. Evelyn felt a sense of symbolism in the changing sky. She was leaving behind her old life and driving towards a new day, filled with possibilities and challenges. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt truly alive. The road stretched out before her, leading to answers, to confrontations, and perhaps to a version of herself she had long forgotten. The rain intensified as Evelyn drove through the night. Her windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. She leaned forward, straining to see the road ahead. A sudden gust of wind rocked the car. Evelyn's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She should have waited out the storm, but the urgency of her mission pushed her forward. As she rounded a curve, her headlights illuminated a fallen tree branch. Evelyn swerved to avoid it. The car's tires lost traction on the wet road. She felt the sickening sensation of the vehicle spinning out of control. The world tilted and blurred. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. When everything finally stopped moving, Evelyn found herself hanging upside down, held in place by her seatbelt. Pain radiated from her left arm. Something warm trickled down her face. Evelyn blinked, trying to clear her vision. She needed to get out of the car. Her fingers fumbled with the seatbelt release. When it finally gave way, she collapsed onto the roof of the overturned car. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body. Evelyn crawled out through the broken driver's side window. The rain soaked her immediately. She dragged herself away from the wreckage, collapsing on the wet grass by the roadside. Despair washed over her. She was hurt, alone, and miles from help. Had she made a terrible mistake in leaving? Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling the rain on her face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Evelyn's eyes snapped open. A man stood over her, concern etched on his face. She hadn't heard him approach. I don't know," Evelyn managed to say. The stranger knelt beside her. "I'm John. I saw your car from the road. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" Evelyn assessed her injuries. "My arm and my head, I think." John nodded. "I've called for help. They should be here soon. Let's get you out of the rain." With John's assistance, Evelyn managed to stand and hobble to his car, parked a short distance away. The warmth inside was a relief after the cold rain. "You're lucky I came along," John said, handing her a bottle of water. "Not many people on the road at this hour." Evelyn took a sip, studying John. He seemed genuinely concerned, but something about him made her uneasy. "Where were you headed?" John asked. "To see my mother," Evelyn replied cautiously. "She's in the hospital." A flicker of recognition crossed John's face. "Margaret Hawthorne?" Evelyn tensed. "How did you know that?" John hesitated. I've heard the name around town. Small world, isn't it?" Evelyn's suspicion grew. This was too much of a coincidence. "Who are you really?" she demanded. John sighed. "I suppose there's no point in pretending. I know who you are, Evelyn. I've been keeping an eye on you." "Why?" Evelyn's heart raced. Was he working for Howard? "It's complicated," John said. "Let's just say we have a connection, one that goes back many years." Evelyn's mind whirled. Could this man be connected to her past, to the secrets Margaret and Howard had kept from her? Before she could press further, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The ambulance had arrived. As paramedics tended to her injuries, Evelyn watched John speaking with a police officer. She caught fragments of their conversation, something about arranging for her car to be towed. When the paramedics suggested taking her to the hospital, Evelyn hesitated. She needed to get to Margaret, but her injuries and exhaustion were catching up with her. John approached as she debated. "Let them take you to get checked out," he said. "I'll make sure you get to Margaret afterward, I promise." Evelyn studied his face, searching for any sign of deceit. Despite her suspicions, she felt an inexplicable urge to trust him. "All right," she finally agreed. As the paramedics helped her into the ambulance, Evelyn's gaze locked with John's. Who was this man? How was he connected to her past? The doors closed, and the ambulance pulled away. Evelyn lay back, feeling the adrenaline drain from her body. The night's events caught up with her, and she felt suddenly old and vulnerable. But beneath the pain and exhaustion, a spark of determination remained. She had come too far to give up now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets John held, Evelyn was committed to seeing this through. As the ambulance sped through the night, Evelyn closed her eyes. She would rest, recover, and then continue her journey. The truth about Margaret, about her past, about herself, was waiting, and Evelyn was more determined than ever to uncover it. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat of John's car, her arm in a sling and a bandage on her forehead. The hospital had cleared her to travel, but advised rest. John had insisted on driving her to see Margaret. The atmosphere in the car was tense. Evelyn watched John from the corner of her eye, questions burning in her mind. "How do you know my mother?" Evelyn finally asked. John's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "It's complicated. Let's just say our families have a history." Evelyn frowned. "That's not an answer." "No, it's not," John agreed. "But it's all I can give you right now." They lapsed into silence. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle of John's involvement in her life. As they entered a small town, John pulled into a diner parking lot. "We should eat," he said. "It's been a long night." Inside, they sat at a booth. The waitress, an older woman named Betty according to her name tag, took their order. "You two aren't from around here, are you?" Betty asked. "Just passing through," John replied. "On our way to Greenville." Betty's eyes widened. "Greenville? That's where that big scandal happened a few years back. Something about a wealthy family and embezzlement." Evelyn's head snapped up. "What family?" "Oh, I don't remember the name," Betty said. "But it was all over the news. The patriarch died, and then all these financial irregularities came to light. His widow and some lawyer were implicated, I think." Evelyn's heart raced. Could this be connected to Margaret and Howard? After Betty left, Evelyn turned to John. "Did you know about this?" John's expression was unreadable. "I've heard rumors." "More than rumors, I'd bet," Evelyn said. "What aren't you telling me?" Before John could answer, Betty returned with their food. As she set down the plates, she studied Evelyn. "You know, you remind me of someone," Betty said. "There was a picture of the family in the paper. The daughter, I think. She wasn't involved in the scandal, poor thing." Evelyn's hands shook as she picked up her fork. Could Betty be talking about her? But that was impossible. She would have known if her family had been involved in a scandal. As they ate, Evelyn's mind whirled. The more she learned, the less she seemed to understand. She felt overwhelmed, uncertain if she could handle more revelations. "Maybe this was a mistake," Evelyn said quietly. "Maybe I should just go home." John looked at her sharply. "After coming all this way?" Evelyn sighed. "I'm tired, John. I'm hurt. And every new piece of information just makes things more confusing. What if the truth is worse than not knowing?" "Excuse me," a voice interrupted. An elderly woman had approached their table. I couldn't help overhearing. "Are you on some kind of journey?" Evelyn nodded hesitantly. The woman smiled. "I made a similar trip when I was about your age, to confront my past and find answers. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." "Were you scared?" Evelyn asked. "Terrified," the woman admitted. "But you know what? The fear of regret was stronger than the fear of the truth. Don't give up, dear. You've come too far to turn back now." As the woman walked away, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of determination. She turned to John. "Let's go. We have a long drive ahead." Back on the road, Evelyn's mind returned to the scandal Betty had mentioned. "John, I need you to be honest with me. Is there a connection between that embezzlement case and my family?" John was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he finally said. "But it's not what you think. Your father, he wasn't the embezzler, he was the whistleblower." Evelyn gasped. "What?" "Your father discovered the fraud. He was going to expose it, but—" John trailed off. "But what?" Evelyn pressed. "He died before he could. Officially it was an accident, but there were always questions." Evelyn felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about her family was unraveling. "Is that why you're helping me?" she asked. "Because of my father?" John nodded. "Partly. But there's more to it. I promise I'll explain everything when we get to Margaret." As they drove on, Evelyn's emotions swung between shock, curiosity, and a grim determination to uncover the full truth. The elderly woman's words echoed in her mind. She had indeed come too far to turn back now. The road stretched out before them, leading to Margaret and the answers Evelyn had sought for so long. Whatever revelations awaited her, Evelyn was ready to face them. The truth, no matter how painful, was preferable to the lifetime of secrets and half-truths she had endured. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk, staring at the house she'd grown up in. The once vibrant yellow paint had faded, and the garden was overgrown. John waited in the car, giving her space. As she approached the front door, memories flooded back. Birthday parties, holiday dinners, heated arguments. Evelyn's hand trembled as she rang the doorbell. A middle-aged man answered. "Can I help you?" "I'm Evelyn Hawthorne. I used to live here." Recognition flashed in the man's eyes. "Of course, I'm Tom. I bought the house from your mother. Please come in." Inside, Evelyn was struck by how much had changed, yet how familiar it all felt. Tom led her to the living room. "I've been meaning to contact you," Tom said. "When I was renovating the attic, I found some old documents. They seemed important, so I kept them safe." He retrieved a dusty box from a closet. Evelyn's heart raced as she opened it. Inside were legal papers, financial statements, and old letters. As she skimmed the documents, a name caught her eye. Howard. He was mentioned in papers dating back years before she'd met him. How was that possible? "Evelyn?" A voice called from outside. She froze. It was Mr. Jenkins, their old neighbor. Excusing herself, Evelyn stepped onto the porch. Mr. Jenkins, now in his 80s, smiled at her. "I thought that was you," he said. "It's been years." They chatted briefly about the old days, until Mr. Jenkins' expression turned serious. "Evelyn, there's something you should know," he said. "Your father, his death wasn't an accident." Evelyn's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "The night before he died, I overheard him arguing with someone. He said he was going to expose some kind of fraud. The next day..." Mr. Jenkins trailed off. Evelyn's mind reeled. This confirmed what John had hinted at. But who had her father been arguing with? Thanking Mr. Jenkins, Evelyn returned inside, her head spinning. She needed to process this information, to talk to Margaret. She reached for her phone to call the hospital. It rang in her hand. Howard's name flashed on the screen. Evelyn hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Evelyn, where are you?" Howard's voice was tense. "Come home. We can work this out." "There's nothing to work out, Howard. I know you've been lying to me." "You don't understand," Howard pleaded. "Everything I did was to protect you." "Protect me?" Evelyn's voice rose. "By keeping me in the dark? By controlling my life?" "Listen to me," Howard's tone turned threatening. "If you continue this foolish quest, you'll regret it. There are things you don't know, things that could hurt you." Evelyn's fear turned to anger. "No, Howard. I'm done being manipulated. I'm going to see my mother, and I'm going to learn the truth." She hung up, her hands shaking. As she turned to go back to the living room, she froze. Howard stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. "How did you?" Evelyn started. "Did you think I wouldn't know where you'd go?" Howard snarled, advancing towards her. Evelyn backed away, her heart pounding. "Stay away from me, Howard." "You ungrateful woman," Howard spat. "After everything I've done for you." He lunged forward, grabbing Evelyn's arm. She cried out in pain, her recent injury flaring. "Let her go." John's voice boomed from behind Howard. In the chaos, Evelyn hadn't heard him enter. Howard spun around, momentarily distracted. Evelyn seized the opportunity, wrenching free from his grasp and stumbling towards John. "You," Howard growled, recognizing John. "I should have known you'd be involved." "It's over, Howard," John said calmly. "The truth is coming out, whether you like it or not." Howard's composure cracked. "You don't understand. If the truth comes out, we'll all go down. Margaret, me, even Evelyn." "What are you talking about?" Evelyn demanded. Howard laughed bitterly. "You want the truth? Your precious father wasn't the saint you think he was. He was in it as deep as the rest of us. The only difference is, he got cold feet at the end." Evelyn felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. "You're lying." "Am I?" Howard sneered. "Why don't you ask your mother?" "Oh wait, you can't, because she's the one who silenced your father to save us all." The room spun. Evelyn gripped a chair for support. Could it be true? Had her entire life been built on lies? "That's enough," John said firmly. "Evelyn, we need to go, now." As if in a daze, Evelyn allowed John to lead her out of the house. Howard's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the revelations from Mr. Jenkins and the mysterious documents. In the car, Evelyn sat in stunned silence. The confrontation with Howard had shaken her to her core, but it had also strengthened her resolve. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. "Take me to my mother," Evelyn said, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's time I learned the truth." As they drove away, Evelyn glanced back at her childhood home. She'd come seeking answers, but had only found more questions. Whatever awaited her at the hospital, she knew her life would never be the same. Evelyn stood in the hospital lobby, her heart pounding. The sterile smell and harsh fluorescent lights heightened her anxiety. John placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. They approached the reception desk, where Evelyn inquired about Margaret Hawthorne. "Dr. Patterson will be down to speak with you shortly," the receptionist said. As they waited, Evelyn's emotions oscillated between fear and anger. What would she say to Margaret? How could she confront the woman who had shaped her life for better or worse? "Mrs. Hawthorne?" A man in a white coat approached. "I'm Dr. Patterson. If you'll follow me, we can discuss your mother's condition." In a small consultation room, Dr. Patterson's expression was grave. "Your mother's condition is critical. The stroke has caused significant damage." Evelyn's anger momentarily subsided, replaced by concern. "How long does she have?" "It's hard to say. Hours, maybe days." Dr. Patterson hesitated. "Mrs. Hawthorne, your mother has been quite agitated. She keeps insisting she needs to tell you something important. Whatever it is, it seems to be causing her great distress." Evelyn's curiosity piqued. What could be so important that it troubled Margaret even now? "Can I see her?" Evelyn asked. Dr. Patterson nodded. "Of course, but please, try not to upset her. Her condition is fragile." As they walked to Margaret's room, Evelyn's resolve wavered. Was she ready to face the truth, whatever it might be? Outside Margaret's door, Evelyn paused. Through the window, she could see her mother, small and frail, in the hospital bed. The sight stirred a mix of emotions: pity, resentment, and a deep, aching sadness. "I'll wait out here," John said softly. Evelyn took a deep breath and entered the room. The steady beep of monitors filled the silence. Margaret's eyes were closed, her breathing labored. As Evelyn approached the bed, she noticed a leather-bound book on the bedside table. Curiosity overtook her, and she picked it up. It was a diary, the pages yellowed with age. Evelyn glanced at Margaret, still unconscious, then opened the diary. The first entry was dated over 40 years ago. "I've made a terrible mistake. The baby? She's not mine. But I can't bear to give her up. What have I done?" Evelyn's hands trembled. She flipped through more pages, her eyes catching snippets of text. "Can't tell Robert. He'd never understand. The real mother came looking. I was terrified. Evelyn is 5 now. She's my whole world. How can I ever tell her the truth?" The room spun. Evelyn sank into a chair, her mind reeling. Was this why Margaret had been so desperate to see her? To finally reveal this decades-old secret? A weak voice broke the silence. "Evelyn?" Evelyn looked up. Margaret's eyes were open, filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "You came," Margaret whispered. Evelyn stood, the diary clutched in her hand. A storm of emotions raged within her: shock at the revelation, anger at the deception, and a desperate need for answers. "Why?" Evelyn's voice cracked. "Why did you lie to me all these years?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid of losing you." Evelyn struggled to process this information. Everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, her entire life, was built on a lie. "Who?" Evelyn demanded. "Who are my real parents?" Margaret reached out a trembling hand. "Evelyn, please, there's so much you need to know. About your father, about Howard, about the accident." Evelyn hesitated. Part of her wanted to run, to escape the weight of these revelations, but she had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell me everything," she said. "I'm ready to hear the truth." As Margaret began to speak, Evelyn braced herself. Whatever secrets were about to be revealed, she knew her life would never be the same. The truth she had sought for so long was finally within reach, but at what cost? The monitors beeped steadily, marking the passage of time as Margaret's story unfolded. Outside, John kept vigil, a silent guardian as Evelyn faced the darkest secrets of her past. In the sterile hospital room, surrounded by the evidence of Margaret's mortality, Evelyn prepared to confront the lies that had shaped her entire existence. Evelyn sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, her heart racing. The room was silent, except for the steady beep of monitors. "I'm ready," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything." Margaret took a shaky breath. It all started at the hospital, the day you were born. There was a mix-up, a terrible mistake. Evelyn's grip tightened on the arm of her chair. What are you saying? You're not my biological daughter, Evelyn. The words hung in the air. Evelyn felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her. There was another baby, born the same day, Margaret continued. Somehow, the nurses switched you. By the time we realized, it was too late. We'd already fallen in love with you. Evelyn's mind reeled. So my whole life, it's been a lie? No. Margaret reached for Evelyn's hand. Our love for you was never a lie. Never. As Margaret explained the details of the switch and the decision to keep Evelyn, the monitors began to beep erratically. Margaret's face contorted in pain. Mom? Evelyn's anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by panic. What's wrong? Margaret gasped for air. Evelyn, there's more. You need to know. Alarms blared. Medical staff rushed in, pushing Evelyn aside. She watched in horror as they worked to stabilize Margaret. Please, Evelyn begged. Don't die. Not now. After what felt like an eternity, the alarms quieted. The doctor turned to Evelyn. She's stable, but very weak. Try not to agitate her. As the staff left, Evelyn returned to Margaret's side. Her mother's face was pale, her breathing labored. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered. I wanted to tell you so many times. Evelyn's emotions warred within her. Anger at the deception, fear of losing Margaret, confusion about her identity. But underlying it all was a desperate need for answers. Why now? Evelyn asked. Why tell me after all these years? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Because of Howard and the accident. What accident? Your father's death. It wasn't an accident. He discovered something about Howard, about the family fortune. He was going to expose it all. Evelyn's breath caught. Are you saying Howard was involved in Dad's death? Margaret nodded weakly. Howard, he's been managing our family's wealth for years, but he's been embezzling, hiding money. Your father found out. The pieces began to fall into place. Howard's controlling behavior, his desperation to keep Evelyn from Margaret. There's something else, Margaret said. John, the man who brought you here. He's your half-brother. Evelyn's head spun. What? From my first marriage, before I met your father, I gave him up for adoption. I never told anyone. The revelations kept coming, each one more shocking than the last. Evelyn struggled to process it all. All these years, Evelyn said, her voice trembling, you've carried these secrets. Margaret's eyes filled with remorse. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. I see that now. As the full weight of the truth settled on Evelyn, she felt her perception of her life, her identity, shifting. She wasn't who she thought she was. Her family wasn't what she believed. I don't know who I am anymore, Evelyn admitted. Margaret squeezed her hand. You're the same person you've always been. The same strong, kind, beautiful daughter I've loved since the moment I held you. Evelyn felt tears welling up. Despite the lies, despite the secrets, she couldn't deny the love that had shaped her life. What happens now? Evelyn asked. Now, Margaret said, her voice growing weaker. You have a choice. You can let these revelations define you, or you can use them to redefine yourself. Evelyn nodded, a new determination forming within her. I want to know everything. About my biological parents, about John, about the family fortune. No more secrets. Margaret smiled faintly. I'll tell you everything I know. And Evelyn, I hope that someday you can forgive me. As Margaret began to share the full story, Evelyn listened intently. Each revelation was another piece of the puzzle of her life, challenging her understanding of herself and her family. But as she absorbed the truth, Evelyn felt something unexpected. A sense of liberation. The lies that had constrained her life were falling away, leaving her free to redefine herself on her own terms. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, Evelyn knew one thing for certain. She was finally, truly herself. Evelyn sat by Margaret's bedside, holding her hand as the monitors beeped softly. The weight of their final conversation hung in the air. I know it's a lot to process, Margaret said weakly, but I hope you can understand why I did what I did. Evelyn nodded, her emotions a complex mix of grief, anger, and a strange sense of freedom. I'm trying to, Mom. It will take time. Margaret squeezed her hand. There's a box in my closet at home. It has letters and photos from your biological mother. I think you should have them. Before Evelyn could respond, Margaret's eyes closed, and she drifted into sleep. It was the last coherent conversation they would have. Margaret passed away peacefully 2 days later. In the aftermath of Margaret's death, Evelyn found herself adrift. She delayed her return home, staying in a local hotel to sort through Margaret's belongings. In the quiet of Margaret's house, Evelyn discovered the box her mother had mentioned. Inside were letters spanning decades, each one a window into the life of the woman who had given birth to her. Photos showed a woman with Evelyn's eyes and smile. The discovery brought a fresh wave of emotion, but also a sense of connection to a part of herself she'd never known. As Evelyn packed up Margaret's things, she came across an old sketchbook. Flipping through it, she was struck by Margaret's talent. On impulse, Evelyn picked up a pencil and began to draw. Hours passed unnoticed as Evelyn lost herself in the act of creation. When she finally looked up, she was surprised to find a decent sketch of Margaret on the page. Something stirred within her, a spark of passion she'd never experienced before. The next day, Evelyn bought art supplies. She spent the following week experimenting with different mediums, discovering a natural affinity for painting. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. As her stay stretched into weeks, Evelyn's art improved rapidly. She decided to submit some pieces to a local gallery. The response was not what she expected. "These are quite good," the gallery owner said, "but we're looking for more. Contemporary artists, someone who can connect with a younger audience." Evelyn left the gallery, frustration bubbling up inside her. She'd faced her past, uncovered long-buried truths, and now she was being dismissed because of her age. Back at the hotel, Evelyn stared at her reflection. Gray hair, wrinkles, signs of a life lived. But in her eyes, she saw a fire that hadn't been there before. She thought of Margaret, of the biological mother she'd never known, of the years she'd lost to Howard's manipulation. "No," Evelyn said to her reflection. "I won't let them define me, not anymore." With renewed determination, Evelyn packed her car for the journey home. As she drove, she reflected on the whirlwind of changes in her life. She was no longer just Howard's wife or Margaret's daughter. She was Evelyn, artist, survivor, woman on a journey of self-discovery. The familiar landmarks of her hometown came into view. Evelyn felt a mix of apprehension and excitement. How would she explain everything to Susan? What would she say to Howard? As she pulled into her driveway, Evelyn noticed Howard's car was gone. A note on the door informed her he'd left for a business trip. Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had time to plan her next moves. Inside, Evelyn set up a makeshift studio in the spare room. She threw herself into her art, processing her emotions through each brushstroke. Days turned into weeks as she honed her skills. One afternoon, Susan visited, concern etched on her face. "Evelyn, are you okay? No one's heard from you in weeks." Evelyn smiled, gesturing to the canvases around her. "I'm more than okay, Susan. I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be." She shared the whole story with Susan, the revelations about her birth, Margaret's passing, her newfound passion for art. Susan listened, wide-eyed. "Oh, Evelyn," Susan said when she finished. "What are you going to do now?" Evelyn looked at her latest painting, a self-portrait that captured both her age and her newfound vitality. "I'm going to show the world that it's never too late to start over, to chase your dreams." As Susan left, promising her support, Evelyn felt a surge of purpose. She understood now why Margaret had kept her, why she'd protected her all these years. It wasn't just love, it was the recognition of potential, of a life waiting to be fully lived. Evelyn picked up her brush again. She had a lot of lost time to make up for, and she was just getting started. Evelyn stood at the entrance of her hometown's community center, her heart racing. Inside, her first art exhibition awaited its grand opening. At 70, she was embarking on a new chapter of her life. The past year had been a whirlwind of confrontations, revelations, and personal growth. After Margaret's passing, Evelyn had returned home with a newfound determination to reclaim her life and identity. Her first order of business had been confronting Howard. Armed with the truth and legal documentation, she had exposed his years of financial manipulation and deceit. "It's over, Howard," Evelyn had said, her voice steady. "I'm taking control of my inheritance and my life." Howard's face had contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, Evelyn. You're nothing without me." But Evelyn had stood her ground, feeling a surge of empowerment. She was no longer the meek, compliant woman Howard had controlled for years. In the months that followed, Evelyn had thrown herself into her newfound passion for painting. Her art became a channel for processing her emotions and experiences. Each brushstroke was an act of self-discovery and healing. As she prepared for her exhibition, Evelyn received an unexpected call. Howard had been arrested for embezzlement and fraud. The full extent of his manipulations was now public knowledge. Despite this victory, Howard made one last attempt to derail Evelyn's progress. The night before the exhibition, Evelyn received an alarming call from the community center. "Mrs. Hawthorne, there's been a break-in. Some of your paintings have been damaged." Evelyn rushed to the center, her heart sinking. Several canvases were slashed, Howard's final act of vengeance. But as she surveyed the damage, a strange calm settled over her. "We'll proceed as planned," she told the concerned staff. "These damaged pieces are now part of my story." The next evening, as guests began to arrive, Evelyn stood tall. The slashed canvases were displayed prominently, each accompanied by a narrative of resilience and rebirth. To Evelyn's surprise, familiar faces appeared in the crowd. Distant relatives, old neighbors, even a few of Howard's former associates came to show their support. Among them was John, her half-brother, who had become a steady presence in her life. As Evelyn guided visitors through her exhibition, she saw the impact of her work in their eyes. Her paintings, raw and honest, spoke of pain, discovery, and ultimately triumph. One piece in particular drew attention. It depicted an older woman emerging from a chrysalis, surrounded by fragments of her past. "This is my favorite," a young art student told Evelyn. "It gives me hope for my own future." Evelyn smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she had chosen to share her story through art. At the end of the evening, Evelyn took center stage. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "This exhibition marks not just my debut as an artist, but the beginning of a new mission." She went on to announce the creation of the Phoenix Foundation, dedicated to helping older women reclaim their identities and pursue their dreams. "It's never too late to reinvent yourself." Evelyn declared, "Our age is not a limitation, but a wealth of experience to draw from." The applause was thunderous. As Evelyn looked out at the crowd, she saw not just approval, but inspiration. Her journey, her struggles, her triumph, all of it now served a greater purpose. In the days that followed, Evelyn's exhibition gained unexpected attention. Local media covered the story of her late-life transformation and the dramatic events leading to it. Women from all over the country reached out, sharing their own stories and thanking Evelyn for her courage. Evelyn embraced her new role with enthusiasm. She spoke at women's groups, mentored aspiring older artists, and continued to create compelling artwork. Her life, once constrained by secrets and manipulation, now overflowed with purpose and authenticity. One afternoon, as Evelyn prepared for a foundation event, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was confident, serene, and vibrantly alive. She barely resembled the Evelyn of a year ago. "You were right, Margaret," Evelyn whispered to herself. "The truth didn't define me. It freed me to redefine myself." With a smile, Evelyn turned from the mirror and walked out the door. Her past no longer haunted her. Instead, it fueled her mission to help others find their own path to resurrection and renewal. At 70, Evelyn Hawthorne was just getting started. If Evelyn's journey touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this tale resonated with you, or if you have your own story of late-life transformation. Remember, it's never too late to rewrite your own story. As Evelyn showed us, sometimes life's most beautiful chapters begin in our golden years.